today we're going to be doing more sourdough. So what I've realized is that maybe you don't have a starter. So I want to show you how to start a sourdough starter and maybe give some tips and tricks in the meantime. Today's a bake day for me. I just did one last week, but I gave away some of our bread, so I have to do another one. So I already have two starters going here. But I'm gonna use the term starter, and sourdough purists are gonna be mad about it because what they'll call this bubbly growing thing in this jar is a levain. And then they'll call this the starter for the bread. It's basically all the same thing. I'm not a sourdough purist. I don't think of sourdough as a science so much as I think of it as an art. So a lot of it just comes with time and with experimentation. So in order to start your starter, you're going to need flour and water and a relatively warm place to store your culture. So I live in Central Florida. It's always warm here, even when the air conditioning is on, it's still warm. I don't have this problem, but if you live somewhere like, you know, in the Arctic Circle, i.e. like the Northeast or the Northwest, you're gonna have to go out of your way to make sure that this place, your starter has a warm place to live. So you can start your starter in 100 different ways. Literally, you can use just about anything, any type of flour you want, as long as it's unbleached. A lot of like the starter purists, sourdough purists, will say you need to start with rye flour. I didn't start mine with rye flour, I started mine with bread flour. So it's not necessary. You can do it with whole wheat flour. As long as your flour has a good gluten content, it's gonna be relatively easy to start a starter. So what we're gonna do here is I just have some organic, unbleached, all-purpose flour in here that's not even bread flour. And I've got a clean jar. And what you wanna do is, it's very handy that I have my little drawer with all my measuring utensils right here. So you want to do equal amounts of flour and water. And just like in my last video, you want to be sure that your water doesn't have chlorine or bleach in it. So no tap water if you're on city water. Well water is fine as long as you don't have chemicals in your water. You can do distilled water, or you can do tap water that you've left out on the counter overnight. So that helps off-gas the chlorine that's in the water. You don't want to put anything into your starter that's going to kill it before it gets the chance to grow. And bleach is one of those things that will do that. All right, so my head's going to be cut off a little bit here because I wanted to just show the workspace. And I have a long counter here, but it's not long enough for the phone and the ring light setup or whatever. So just bear with me not having a head and just being a disembodied voice. All right, so what you're gonna do is you're gonna start with your mason jar and some flour. The exact amount is not important here. And if you're a sourdough purist, you're just gonna be mad, okay? So I did 2 tablespoons of flour, and I'm going to do the same amount in water. So 2 tablespoons of water. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna mix this up. You wanna make sure that your hands are clean, that your utensils are clean, everything you're using is clean. Because what you're gonna do is you're going to cultivate the wild yeast that's in your local environment. So some people will take their jars outside and they'll try to catch wild yeast like that. You don't have to. There's yeast on every surface in your home. There's yeast on your hands. This will do the job without any fuss. All right, so congratulations. Once you've gotten, you wanna make sure that you have it's very, very well stirred. Like you don't want any dry flour in there at all. All right, so here's your setup for your starter. It's that simple. It's just flour, water, and it can be pretty much any flour you want. If you want like a really strong starter right off the bat, rye flour really is the best flour, but this will work too. So just kind of look at your jar, make sure you don't have any dry flour along the bottom. I had a little bit there, a little bit more there. Okay, so now what we're gonna do is we're going to cover this with either saran wrap or cheesecloth, something that allows it to culture. So let me put this down here. I'm gonna cover this with a mason jar lid. I want it relatively airtight. It doesn't have, airtight is not important. What's important is that nothing can get in. So you don't want like gnats or bugs or flies, or I don't know if you have animals, animal hair, or if you have small children, dirty fingers. You don't want anything getting in here. So you just set that. And then what you're gonna do is you're going to wait. So now you're gonna feed this. So I'm feeding this, it's 3 p.m., right? So about every 12 hours you wanna feed this. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna let all of the yeasty bacteria, there's bad bacteria in here right now. This is not ready to use. This is gonna take some time. So I'm gonna kind of document this a little bit as we go along, but this is how you start a starter. It is much easier to start a starter off of somebody else's starter. So if you know anybody who's doing sourdough, ask them for some starter. They will gladly give you some. You can also buy it online. You can buy it on Etsy. You can buy it on Amazon even. You can get a dry starter and it will already have yeast ready to go. So what you're doing here is you're taking the yeast that's available naturally to you in your local environment, and you're essentially replacing instant rise yeast. So I have this for different types of bread or other types of baking that needs the extra rise. So this is commercially created. It's still yeast. It will have a different flavor because it's a different strain of yeast, but it's still yeast. And the baking, whatever you want to call this, the yeast industry, big yeast, okay? What they've done is they've cultivated specific strands of yeast that are very stable and very easy and very predictable. So that's what your instant or dry yeast is. It's just yeast that's been cultivated that's very stable and very predictable. So you know that if you use it, every time you use it, it's gonna have basically the same outcome. So your homegrown yeast in a starter for sourdough is not the same. It's a living creature. This is it's like a child. It's a pet, you know. A lot of people name their sourdoughs. Mine's Jane Doe, in case you were wondering. This is a 4-year pet. This pet is now 4 years old. Not this particular jar, but this ongoing project has been going on for 4 years. So I am by no means an expert, and I'm sure there are other people out there that are gonna give you way better information than I am, but I'm just gonna share with you what works for me and my family and what works for our busy schedule. So that being said, I'm gonna go ahead and pair off some of this to put in the fridge. So this started as one of the smallest mason jars, like this big, right? And so I wanted to bake with it. Well, if I only have this much yeast, that's not a lot to work with. So, or this much starter, sorry. That's not a lot to work with. So what I do is I feed it and I grow it in a bigger jar. So yesterday morning, I pulled my small jar out of the fridge. I scraped it all into here and it equaled about 50 grams. And then I fed it 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. And then I stirred it and I let that double, which took about 6 hours. Maybe not quite that long. But then once it doubled, I punched it down. It was 150 grams. And so then I fed it 150 grams of flour and 150 grams of water, and I stirred it. And then you can see that that little 50 grams was like literally that much. So in 2 days, it's gotten to that much, so 4 cups. So when I first started with sourdough, I wanted to save it all because I was like, oh, I don't want to waste anything. But there does come a point in time where if you're using sourdough a lot, then you end up having to actually discard some of it because it's just a lot. It creates a lot of starter. So hopefully that's not confusing. So this little thing that I just did here, that's gonna sit there and it's going to culture. That's not ready to bake. And it's gonna be probably several weeks before that'll be ready to bake with. But this one is one that I've been culturing for years, so it's ready at any moment. And once you get a really strong starter, you can just put it in the fridge and forget about it for months or even years. I went through almost a 2-year period where I didn't use my starter at all because we were in the process of building a house and moving and things got crazy. And so I really didn't touch my starter for 2 years. It just lived in the back of my fridge. And when I pulled it out, I didn't have real high hopes that it was actually going to do anything, but it did. I was so surprised. It baked right away. All it needed was just to be fed. So it was very resilient. So if you're worried about this process and that you're gonna that it's gonna be hard, there are some parts of the process that are difficult, but not really. It's mostly just trial and error, patience, and experimentation. So what I'm gonna do here is we have a good starter ready to go. It's all nice and bubbly. It smells yeasty, so that's a good sign. And I'm going to go ahead and feed this for bread. So I have 2 here, which I've done this process already, but I'll just show you again, just for giggles. So what you're doing is you're creating a dough out of the starter, and it needs to be similar to biscuit dough. At least this is the type of this is the easiest. I like to work with a stiff starter. So I'll show you the difference between a stiff starter and a liquid starter. Because as I'm growing my starter, it's liquid, but once I want to bake with it, I want it stiff. So I use this little, I think it's a 2 tablespoon ice cream scooper or a cookie dough scooper. Pretty sure I got it from Target, but all right. So see how liquidy that is? I didn't have to even so that's equal parts flour, water, and starter. And that gives you a liquid starter, which it's just, I don't know, for me, it's easier to maintain a liquid starter. It might not be easy for you though, so don't feel bad if you have to switch to a stiff starter, that's fine. All right, so what I'm adding, that's 2 tablespoons of liquid starter, 1/3 cup of flour, and 2 tablespoons of water. So see how I added way more flour than I added starter and water this time? So what I'm doing is I'm turning that liquid starter into a stiff starter. So that stiff starter is much easier to work with when you're ready to actually make bread. It's not easier though when you're culturing your starter. And it's also not easier to store a stiff starter. I feel like it's way easier to store a liquid starter. Also, one of the reasons that I like to use liquid starter is because it's easier for me to turn it into other things other than bread. So just the other day, I made sourdough pancakes. That's one of our favorites. And I do that by taking all of the discard from growing the starter over every couple of weeks. And when I get about 4 cups, then I make a batch of pancakes. So that makes that takes about 2 or 3 weeks for me to get 4 cups of starter discard. Do you have to discard starter? No, you do not. You don't have to discard anything. You can keep it, but it does get to be a lot. So that's about the texture. So see, we went from that liquidy texture to this biscuit dough texture. I'm from the South, so this is what our biscuit dough looks like. All right, I'm gonna punch that down in there, and I'm gonna repeat that process. So I'll show you how much starter I have left over after growing it. So I've got about 2 tablespoons of my liquid starter. And so it's kind of hard to see, but right there at the 2-cup line is about how much liquid starter I have left at the end of making 4 loaves of bread. So this I will then cap and stick it in the fridge, and this is my discard jar now. So when I go to make bread again, what I'll do, oh, hold on, let me not miss a step in this process. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna take some of the starter and save it for the next time I wanna make bread. So I'll take a scoop, and usually I use the little mason jars, like the tiny little jelly jars, the half pints, I guess, right? No, this is a half pint because it's only 1 cup. And so I'll take a couple scoops of this, and now this is ready to go live in the fridge. And this is how my vacuum needs to be clean, so it's yelling at me. Just ignore it. All right, so this is how I will start baking another set of 4 loaves of bread. So this just lives in the fridge, and it doesn't expire. It might get a little gray, which means it's hungry. It might develop some like alcohol on the top of it, which is hooch, and you can just pour that off, or you can stir it in, that's fine. But as long as this doesn't get pink, blue, or green, you're good. This is still good to use. So this, what we mixed at the beginning of the video, will eventually become this, but it's not there yet. So this is gonna get capped and stuck in the fridge eventually. All right, so I'm going back to mixing this bread. 1/3 cup of flour, 2 tablespoons of water, 1, 2, and I'm sure I've mentioned this before, but we have a well, and our well is actually a spring, so we have spring water. So I don't have to use any like purified or distilled or anything. I just want to make sure that the water that you're using doesn't have any bleach in it. And so I'm just mashing this together to get that stiff biscuit consistency. And you can freeze your sourdough bread too. So once you've actually gone through the whole process of baking it, so say during Christmas when I know I'm gonna be super busy and I'm not gonna have time to bake because I'm busy with other stuff, I can make several loaves of bread, stick them all in the freezer, and then pull them out as I need them during the season. So, don't be afraid to go a little overboard and make more than you need. And you can share it with neighbors, people at church, So there you go, there's that stiff biscuit consistency. And then I'm going to clean up my mess here. This counter is always a mess because I'm always cooking something. And so these now, I'm going to cover them. I'm going to spray them with some oil. You can use olive oil. I like avocado oil, doesn't matter. Just spray them with some oil and then cover them and let them double in size. It's gonna take about 6 to 8 hours. So this is your first feeding of your starter to turn it into bread. So if you have starter, this would be the next step into making bread. And since that's gonna take 6 to 8 hours, I'm gonna release this as just its own video. And then when I go to make bread tomorrow, I'll post another video with how I do the next set of steps, and hopefully it's less confusing, and hopefully it sounds better this time too, since I've got a microphone. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. I'll try to get to them as soon as possible. All right, well, have a good day, guys. Sola Deo Gloria. Bye.